Hello, everyone, and welcome to Rocket Lasso Live, Season 2, Episode 27. I am Chris Schmidt, and we are answering questions live from a Twitch chat and a YouTube chat because we're simultaneously streaming to both of those. So, for the majority of people who are going to be watching this after the fact, welcome, hello. You can come and join and hang out in the live streams. I do them every Wednesday at, well, not every Wednesday, but for many of the Wednesdays throughout the year. And you can come and ask questions. I randomly pick them from the chat, and it's really cool. For the people who are actually here, we're already saying hello and going through the names and saying hi to everyone. So thank you so much for coming and hanging out. And without the questions, there would not be a live show. Now, we've already got a bunch of questions starting to pop in all over the place. I will start tackling them, share the screen here before I mess that up, and start clicking around. I'll start with Twitch this time. Layered waves. Says it's an origami thing, so you never know what you're going to get. Let's see what we've got. Ooh, that's cool looking. So this is some stock imagery created by Tall4. And yeah, it's pretty cool. Now, the assumption here, I wish that the cinema bool is, they didn't improve it, but my understanding of how to use it improved a bunch. And I mean, really, this is just like a layer paper effect. So that specific example is fine, but it's actually a style that I really like. So we can do things more generally. What's a good way of addressing this? An immediate thought would be, it would be nice if we, transferring things to splines is a very natural thought here, but the tools in Cinema currently don't allow for that to be done very easily. So in a lot of ways, I immediately want to think about things in a more Boolean sense. But of course, we know Booles in Cinema can be a little bit twitchy, especially if you're doing animation. If it's a still, you don't have to worry about it very much at all. To begin, I'll start real simple, creating a plane set to 1000 by 1000 with no subdivisions to start out really cleanly. And depending on what type of shape that we're feeding into this, then we could get various types of control. Let's just try layering up like a series of text. I know it's very different than what we were looking at there, but we'll be able to get various different bits of control depending on what setup we feed in. So let's go with our old friend, the mo text. Hit R for rotate, lie it flat on the ground. I'm having trouble getting the 90. And we'll use my old favorite, ampersand. Boop. T for scale. We probably want a chunkier one, so you know that I'll probably go for the one I know works, which is one of our Futura bowl that works nicely. Let this sneak up through the surface just a little bit. If I want it to be centered a little more parametrically, I can make sure that's set to middle, but we have to scoot it down there. T for scale, and let's just say this is the largest one. Now, if we want to take a bite out of this, the basic setup is pretty straightforward. Let's see how much it cooperates and how far we can push the bool to make this behave itself. So in this case, you put in A, and it's A subtract B is the default. So if we make the text the second object, that's what it cuts out. A subtract B is a good default to remember. Now, if we hit NB, the shortcut on the keyboard, we're now seeing the polygons here. You can see polygons. And you can see that this is actually by default, and they changed the default. And I'm always curious if they changed the default based on their own thing or because I started talking about it in different presentations. There is a button that didn't used to be on by default, and that's hide new edges. And that would make it look all super messy like this. But actually, if you turn it on, it creates n-gons instead, which creates very clean geometry. And you can actually start doing a series of bools, and it usually does a pretty good job. Now, just as we're throwing this into some very basic geometry, but this type of animation, we would use very basic, clean geometry. So if I were to take this and start moving it around, I don't think we're going to get any weird pops or twitches. You see, that's actually all pretty smooth. Now, if we start exiting out the side, I wouldn't be surprised if we got a bad frame. But once again, with hide new edges turned on, you get pretty good results. And for anybody who's not familiar, there's just a thing, it's just kind of a rule in cinema when you're using it a bunch, is it's very difficult to do an animation using a bool because it's very likely you're going to get a couple of bad frames just randomly where it's like, it didn't correctly calculate. But like I'm saying, if we build it kind of the way I am right now, we could actually end up with some fairly clean geometry. Now, you'll notice I fed this initially into a plane, and I don't know if the reference had any thickness. It's hard to tell. Maybe yes, maybe no. It's the way things layer up on top of each other. That would be the end result. But I want to start layering these up more. Now, it's not going to be super easy to inflate this mesh. It might actually start making some messy meshes. So I think it might be nice to actually just throw this into a volume builder and then a volume mesher. So it's actually a volumed mesh that's getting booled out. And you see it's going to round the corners a little bit, but it makes it nice and smooth and even. And the idea here, yeah, this is fine. Let's just make this layer 1, copy and paste, scoot the entire thing down. How far? Oh no, I hope it's not doing that again. I had a weird bug happen to me yesterday with my mouse where, okay, it's working. I had a weird bug happen yesterday where my mouse, it was not Cinema, my mouse itself started not working properly and I had to unplug it and replug it in to make it go. Now, we can create a second layer, perfectly fine, and it's got its own copy of that text. What's cool is inside the volume builder, I can start inflating it or shrinking it. In this case, I suppose shrinking it by make a dilate and erode. So by creating that, currently it's expanding 5 units. I can set it to -1. Jaspal, thank you for the donation. I'm not sure what currency that's in, so I don't know the amount, but regardless, thank you very much for the donation. The dilation go -5, and now you can see it shrank a little bit. The overall scale is pretty big, so I'm going to say -10, and you can see that shrinks it up a little bit more. Now, because it's smaller, we might want to increase its voxel size to just make that a little bit more detailed. Yeah, you see that automatically makes that smoother. That looks good. And I'm going to just do this a couple of times. So this will be layer 2, copy, paste, scoot it down. Scoot it down. How far did we go? Yeah, we went. I am not grabbing my layers very cleanly here. Apologies for that. I'd layer them up the way I usually do, which is if it's above the object, I like having it visually above it in the hierarchy. So move that one down, make another duplicate. I wonder if that's actually a more complicated hierarchy than I think it is, because it is actually chugging a little bit. Maybe I did subdivide it quite a bit. And that is -20. Of course, we can just type in ×2, and that will push it down. And that is another layer. And then this layer, it can have its dilation go double that amount, ×2. And we can start making okay, actually -20 on that is enough for it to completely disappear. So we have to be careful with that. Yeah. So in this case, -15 was a little bit better. And I'll do one last one. I'm not sure what our calculation time is looking like there, but one more duplicate. Well, it's very surprisingly choking on those. You can see even when I click, it's taking like a full second. Oops. It's taking a full second for it to acknowledge that. And one last dilation should work on here. Not sure what a good amount will be, so I'll say -17. Did it not go down? Man, I -20, enter. There, it went down. So you can see it now. I'm starting to layer these up. I'm not sure how long these calculation times are taking. So if I were to grab all these volume objects, which are actually the main ones, and you can see how there's a lot of polygons being thrown in there. So I'm sympathetic to Cinema trying to do all those calculations. Actually, this is actually turning into another good example of trying to be careful with this stuff, because there's so much calculation going on. It's taking a really long time for this to process, and it's not. If I was trying to make an animation out of this would not be a good version of this. Now, for our purposes, it might make it a little bit chunkier. Voxel size jumping back up to 10, though, should make everything go faster, even though they look a little bit more jittery there. And if we look at our poly counts again, they're a little more reasonable. And I'm just curious how quick it refreshes. I mean, yeah, it makes a big difference if you lower that. Now, it's still chugging along at only 2 frames a second, but it's controllable at least. And we can scoot those around. Now, you see we're actually not seeing any bad frames. This is able to handle all of that. We could, of course, lower our detail even further for basic testing purposes. In addition to that, I wonder to what degree we could get away with just inflating the original object. There are problems with that, though, like geometry will start intersecting and it doesn't look great. Now, this is an actual hole being created in here, which means we can turn on some SSAO, and we should see some nice separation between the layers, which is really cool. You want essentially some, ambient occlusion or shadows to separate the layers. Otherwise, what's the point? And we can see that right there in the viewport, which is nice. Let's see. I'm trying to think of where to go. This is the basics of some of the volume getting calculated. And I wonder if there would be ways of letting them cross expand. Not a great idea there. No, I'm kind of not sure where to go with this. If we're looking at the original, the point here, as I was trying to make the text, and we immediately saw this start choking on some of this geometry a little bit. Some of the thoughts turn into, if we were to keep on lowering this down so they calculate way quicker, each time we change that number, it's going to be a significant improvement in the amount of calculation time. But we're going to start getting these really jagged edges as things are sort of poking through and just don't have the fidelity it needs to travel around the outside. So that's one issue that we'd be having to deal with. We could be creating this via alphas. We could be creating this via a whole bunch of different means. Now, let's resimplify a little bit. I'll save the scene file. And of course, just to throw it out there, if you like reverse engineering things like I do, then you can get access to all of these scene files on Patreon. Let's just say paper cutouts. All right. Once again, let's simplify. Delete a bunch of the layers. We're only dealing with the singular layer. And this is the default one. If we turn off the bool, we can see the actual geometry getting fed in. You can see why it looks so chunky. It's actually doing a good job of it. And you see it's just really chunky text that we're feeding in. Various things that we could do here. One thought was, what if we pull it out entirely from that volume mesher, which is obviously taking a while to count, and there's a lot of geometry there. Could we inflate this text by itself? Yes, but at a certain point, they're going to start, the polygons will cross over each other and it will mess it up. And in this case, I want to deform this original text via a plane effector. Make the plane effector a child of the mode text. In fact, I think I might have accidentally fed it into, I fed in the plane effector into the letters because it was pre-selected. Now I can treat this as a deformer and inflate it. So I can say, yes, push out on the point, not on Y, yes, on Z. And you see that, well, let's turn off the bool so we can see it. As I increase this, it's actually going to deform everything and push every single point outward. Now, we do have different deformation modes. This is point mode. It might be a little cleaner if we say polygon, and now the individual polygons are inflating outward. You see I can push that, and that will work, and it will work with the bool, but only to a certain extent. At a certain point, once we inflate it too far, these points will cross over each other, and I imagine it's going to confuse the bool, and rightly so. Like, once these polygons start passing through each other, it doesn't know what it's doing anymore, and this is just not valid. So this gives us a very limited range. You can kind of see the range of this particular letter with this particular subdivision of how far we could push that. Having said that, it is very clean for that limited range, so something to keep in mind. Now, we are sort of entering into this with the text as a very basic shape that we could feed in. Now, if you were feeding in something like, like this is stylized water effect, and honestly, in a lot of ways, it'd just be like, oh, just create the illustration. You can just draw that, extrude it, and throw it in really cleanly. But if we're continuing with the Boolean idea, you could be generating some sort of geometry as it goes. In this case, I'm trying to think of what a good... Actually, why don't we create a null, and I'll let that null zip around the scene. So we could use signal from Grayscale Gorilla, but just in case anybody doesn't have it, we'll use the vibrate tag, in which case I can turn on enable position. This is 1000 wide. Let's say 500 on X and Z. Slow it way down, hit play, and we can see this null traveling around doing its thing. Now we can create a tracer, and there's a line being traced where it's traveling. I can never remember if this is double the amount or not, but you know what? I'm going to increase this so it's shooting around. It's going to be shooting around all over the place. In fact, we could probably do exactly 1000 or 999 because it's quicker to type in. A few extra frames. There we go. So that should be zipping around, creating that shape for us, and we can feed this into any bit of geometry that we want. In this case, I mean, I'm still inclined, the volumes were really slowing us down because of how much geometry there is, but I would really love to throw this in the volume because as it crosses over itself, that would still be valid. So I'm reluctant to, but I'm going to do it anyway. Create another builder, mesher, builder in the mesher, spline in the builder, and now it creates this overall geometry. Now that's creating that geometry inside the tracer, we can determine how the radius is created. So we can really increase the radius really large. And now by pulling it down on one side, we can taper it. So that's remapping that. Now we have to be a certain minimum size, otherwise it'll just disappear. So something like that is the minimum. Now, this is not booled yet, obviously, but as we pull it out, we can see that it is leaving this trail. Given the nature of this wake behind it, I think limiting it from the end, set it to 11. Now we can get this little teardrop shape chasing behind and set that to any length of animation we want. So it's perpetually the size traveling around, doing its thing. What's great is you get this nice big finalized blob shape. So of course, if this gets fed in as the thing getting Booleaned out, it'll just cut that shape out. And as long as we only have one volume, I think that'll probably work pretty well. And now you get this shape, and it's just doing a pretty good job of it. This final geometry obviously isn't the smoothest thing. Turning off the bool again, we can see, you know, there's a lot of extra information in this line. We could smooth it out with a smoothing deformer. I don't think that's going to do that great of a job for us in this context. So under the mesher, we can put that in, get rid of all of this extra stiffness, and we'll see what kind of a job that does for us. It's doing an all right job. It's doing something. And we're getting this line tracing out. Now that is some final looking geometry in here. This entire thing could be given thickness via being fed into a NURBS object, specifically the cloth surface. Currently it's subdividing, but I don't want to subdivide. I want to give it thickness. Now that will create all the geometry, but we hit NA because we're actually just seeing this. Set this up to something so we can actually visually see it. It's actually a little bit difficult to see given the current display. Actually, I'm kind of surprised. What are we getting here? NB. Oh, I said that. My enter key just doesn't seem to be doing what I think it is. All right, there we go. Now you can see that I've actually got a little bit of depth to that because that calculates after the fact. So we get this swoosh with some depth to it. A nice little extra something. And this gives you the basic idea of kind of cutting in the shape as far as a way of doing it cleaner or more parametric. And of course you could displace and modify and layer all these things up however you want to. You know, just as a very quick, for instance, the tracer and null, copy and paste both of those, give the null a different seed, feeding that into the tracer. There should now be two unrelated ones. Actually, the second one probably won't have the same thickness. So yeah, each spline independently is fed its own thickness. So there's actually two splines doing their own thing inside the volume. You see that one behaves one way and the other's behaving very differently. So we'd have to copy those settings. I think we can just copy like this and paste them there. And yeah, now both will have that shape. Now, obviously, the more volume we add in, the slower it's going to calculate. Even on my pretty good machine here, this is starting to chug quite a bit. So that's not a casual thing to throw in. But it is cool looking. Let me think. Level, yeah, I think I did. But yeah, I got rid of subdivision. Thanks for looking at though. I'm trying to think of where to go with the effect. Like I don't care specifically about remaking specifically this. Obviously, you just start layering up some different colors and you can get the different shapes as they go. This is very illustrated. So once again, I would make the assumption that this wasn't 3D at all. It was purely made in vector art. Kind of looks like a crazy snail right now. So yeah, this just creates those shapes and it's pretty neat. I wish that there was a quicker way of doing it as far as keeping everything very spline based. Obviously you could throw things into different spline masks and different spline volumes and extrude those. So of course calculate a lot more quickly. I wonder to let's just tinker with it for a little bit. I will save this version as well, just in case anyone finds it interesting. And for a final example, I don't think we need anything in here. We'll keep the 2 tracers. That's all we need. Everything else goes away. And in this case, we can sweep these shapes, but we can't sweep them with a sweep because it becomes geometry, and we need to stay in the world of splines. So let's say we're doing that exact same 2-dimensional world type thing. So I'll create a square spline, a rectangle spline. Then we've got these lines, and let's say we want to trace them in a very similar way. In this case, I shall create a rectangle spline, lie it flat on the ground, and we can subdivide it as need be. Immediately, I'll set it to uniform subdivision, which should give it a decent subdivision count. And it's really small. It's actually really big right now, so I'll drop it down to 10 by 10. Pretty tiny there. With that in mind, though, we can create the old spline wrap, which is a pretty good deformer. It can be a little unintuitive sometimes, but it's pretty good. So I think along Z is a good idea. So spline wrap. Along Z, what is it tracing? Trace this tracer, and now you see that our volume shape has been mapped onto that spline. Now keep in mind, we have a lot of options we could do from here. Temporarily, I'll hide the line it's tracing onto. You see that subdivisions are super important in this case, in which case I should probably stretch it out on the width. So saying 100 on the width might give it, I guess it's not width, but height. By increasing the height, you see the subdivisions are increasing. Now, uniform is all right, but I think subdivided might be better in this case. And depending on the maximum length we feed in, we're actually subdividing it more and more and more. And you see it's becoming smoother as I increase our count. And that has become quite smooth overall. Turning off the spline wrap, you see this is the original shape. We could, of course, make it longer, and then we don't need the maximum length to be quite as long. And having done all of that, I think we could do additional deformers on it even beforehand. So let's attempt a taper. Throw that in, rotate it, I suppose up 90 degrees there. Fit to parent, and as I increase this amount, it should start squishing. It's hard to tell with the spline wrap visually there. Now you can see, as I increase the strength, it's tapering that down to a point. I don't think we actually want to go to 1 point, so 99% seems like a good idea. Now, turning on the spline wrap, we should have that pointed version traveling along. So you can see I've now made a semi-similar shape to what we had before. Now let's see how, I don't know how well this will work, which is kind of why I want to pursue it. So that is one tracer object. Copy and paste it, a second one that we have now. I'll feed in the other tracer object. Excuse me. Whew. So now we have both of those. We can visually hide the original tracers. And now we have these 2 lines traveling around doing their own thing. That's looking pretty nice. The lines only travel 2-dimensionally, so it should continue to be treated 2-dimensionally. Otherwise, we have to give it a rail of some sort. Now that those are doing that, how well can we mask these? And I honestly don't know. So creating the Cinema Spline Mask object, we can feed both rectangles in. They're currently set to union, so the 2 of them, I actually don't think we want union. No. I think it is union, right? That's immediately not looking correct, though. As soon as they're crossing over each other, they're breaking quite a bit. The axis might be wrong. Along Y. There we go. That's what we wanted. Now, immediately, I could see one problem, and that is, I think, yeah, when these 2 cross over each other, it will work. But if it crosses over itself, it actually doesn't work. So that's a problem. Let's temporarily ignore that and try to combine all of these together. So copy and paste the spline mask one more time. And that should be combining the overall world one and this one. And in this case, I want to just see where those spline masks are intersecting, I believe. So only where they, no, see, they use their terminology differently here. So I'm going to try and. Yeah, so now we're only seeing where they both exist, even though it's sort of the inverse that we want. So we could instead say A subtract B and put the rectangle in first there. Now we kind of see that shape erased out. Now I'm still worried about it crossing over itself, but now you can see that all of these have been combined into one shape, and obviously this is running relatively quickly for us. Let's see what the spline mask does, or an extrude does, with these combined objects when it crosses over itself. Right now they're not crossing over themselves. Putting it into the extrude is automatically detecting angle. I want to control it, and it is extruding up 10 units. And it's looking fine. That's looking very nice. However, I think when it crosses over itself, we're going to get this inverted line like that. which is there's a good chance you don't want that to happen. I don't have a way of fixing it. The advantage of what you see here, though, is we have a lot more control over the subdivisions, and it's running way, way quicker. So you can see how clean that this is. And the spline mask is actually cooperating pretty well. I'm not sure it's working on every single frame. I feel like there's a couple I saw there that might have been inverted. It's hard to tell. But of course, when they cross over each other, it's fine. When they cross over themselves, yeah, there's a couple of frames that didn't look good. So not a perfect process. I just don't have a way around that. The different spline mask types don't have any that completely combine all of them. So yeah, that is a third method that I might pursue depending on what I was trying to do there as far as techniques are concerned. Currently, I don't want to spend any more time on this one. I prefer to tackle some more questions. So we'll end this one here. And we'll just make this the third sort of technique to get somewhat to that area. The specifics of what you want there matter a lot. I'm not sure if it's Leah or Ilya, but yeah, the Cinema 4D Boolean object can definitely not work overly well sometimes. Jaspel, I don't know if you, well, that was an earlier question, but super chat, I thought I had enabled it, but it's not something I'm super familiar with. I do complex setups. Have ever thought about going into Houdini? Yes, I mean, I've tinkered it just a little bit. I tinkered over a long weekend on Houdini, and it's like, oh, this is pretty neat. It's just not where my head's at right now to be able to do that. I think I would enjoy Houdini. It's a lot smaller. There's a lot fewer people using it, and my entire, my life is making like plugins and tools and trying to help people use it. And when you get to the world of Houdini, you end up having big teams of people. Very often when we get links to like, oh, this beautiful thing was made, it's made by a bigger studio who has a big team of people. It's gonna be a lot harder for little independent artists to create entire animations in Houdini. And that tends to be the type of people I like speaking to, is like motion graphics artists who are kind of, a very small shop or like a one-person shop, and they're working themselves. In Houdini, it's going to be very, very difficult for one person to do client work in Houdini. But in Cinema 4D, one person can do everything. So that's one of my main reasons for really, really loving cinema. And that's just kind of the water I like to swim in. Megan. The Goo Rock tutorial. I like how that pops up every once in a while. It's such a weird tutorial, but yeah, the old GSG Goo Rock tutorial. I remember me and Nick having really long conversations trying to be like, I made this tutorial. It's really neat. What do we call it? So it's like, we couldn't think of a name. So it's like, screw it. We're calling it the Goo Rock tutorial. Oh, that's an interesting question. Connor is asking, how would you use like a cloner workflow? So not particles, but use cloners and create a flocking animation, like a school of fish or a flock of birds. That's a good question. I'm not we got limitations for the way that works. A lot of, well, now we have fields, so that potentially adds in additional things. I forget what it was, but there's like some mathematician who would come up with the original kind of flocking concept, and it was just like 3 parameters when it comes to it, which is like an attraction level, and then it's kind of like they would look at their neighbors and then look at the direction that the neighbors were facing and then adopt that. I'm not super familiar with that. So when it comes to the basics of a flocking, like a realistic flocking simulation that would use kind of particle type effects, I don't think we can do that type of thing overly in cinema, or overly in the cloner setup. That's not to say that we can't make an animation that doesn't look quite a bit like a flocking animation. To do the most basic possible version of this so we can very quickly iterate through, I'll do the old create a cone. So we'll make it extra fancy by making it an arrow. Yeah. Woohoo! So this is going to be the basis of our flocking. It's probably, yeah, it's pretty big. So I'll shrink it significantly down and throw this into a cloner. Now we'll be able to create as many clones as we want. Currently a 3x3x3 seems reasonable-ish. Dropping the size down to 100 by 100 by 100. They're all clustered together a little bit. what is the basic way? I mean, a lot of it goes to what is the behavior hoping to get out of something. Now, the super basics would be if you want them to be randomly doing their own thing, typically I'd say you probably just want them to be a particle simulation. Now, if you are using a MoGraph workflow, it's because you want to art direct and control them very specifically. So in this case, I will create a spline shape. Let's just create a little bit of a figure 8 shape, a little offset there, and I'll even scoot up that point and scoot those down. All right, so let's just call that like the bit we want to be traveling around. Now, Cinema has some pretty good, effectors and whatnot that automatically do this type of stuff for us. So let's look at the basics of that. In this case, we have I almost never use it, but the spline effector. Don't use that very often. Applying this into the effector tab in the cloner, the spline effector can be fed, of course, a spline, and all of these shapes are going to become distributed around the entire shape. You see all of them have evenly moved in those positions. They don't have, interestingly, I'm surprised. I mean, if this was made more now, they would automatically have a control. Actually, that's not even true. I guess we do it different ways, but applying the spline effector, we can animate this offset. You can see everything's going to travel around. Okay, relatively straightforward. Now, all of them are on the start and end, so we could pinch all these up to be together a lot more. Now, as I do this, keep in mind, yes, we could use the spline effector, but immediately we're going to the world of like, why are we even using the spline effector? Why not just get rid of the spline effector, use the cloner, clone not as a grid, but as a object. We're going to want to clone onto an object. The object will be the spline. Now they're getting cloned all over the place. Currently, there's a count of 10. That's just fine. I want them to start at 0 and end at whatever amount. So let's just give this like 1 degree. So they're all pretty clustered up on top of each other. I'll even create 20 clones. So they're all pretty clustered up. Now, what's great about using this instead is there's a bunch of automatic animation tools. So I could set the rate to 5. If we hit play, you see these will automatically all travel around the entire spline. We need more frames for the super duper basics. You see all of them are continually moving across. Now you see the speed is going to change dramatically. That's because of the type of spline we're feeding it. Currently it's a Bezier adaptive spline. If we change that to uniform, then it's going to move at a constant rate around the entire thing. So all of them are moving together in a very uniform way. Now, of course, they're all clustered together and they're sticking very near each other. Now in this case, what I would do is put in a random effector. Boom, random effector. This is going to give them variation in their position overall. Let's say 150 on every axis. So they all spread out. That should be pretty much uniformly stuck and they all travel around there. Actually, look how it's going. Bing, bing, bing. You see these little pops as it rotates. If we set the cloner, I think, if we set that to smooth rotation, those should transition more smoothly. Or we just need actually that seems to have helped, but it's not perfect. Keep in mind, we could subdivide this more, like 24 subdivisions, and that might become a lot smoother. All right, so now they're all random, but they're all kind of uniformly random, and they're stuck in that position together. If we were to change this to a noise type, it's a global noise, so they're actually passing through a very large noise. So in this case, I'd probably set these to UV. Yeah, because they're passing through the noise, we have to be careful about the way we apply this, actually. This might be a little trickier than I thought it would be. I'm going to turn on indexed. Yeah, this might work. By turning on indexed, if we say global, we're passing through a giant field of noise. If we say, no, don't calculate them based on global, do the UV. I actually don't know how the UVs calculate. I just know it's on a big cloud. I think it's like individually mapping onto the clone's index. And then by turning on indexed, each of them is independently getting their own unique seed in this world of noise. So now the best way to see this is if we temporarily turn off the rate and hit play, then these should be wiggling around, doing their own motion on top of each other. And now we can control that via the animation speed and the scale, specifically just the speed. Since they're all indexed, the scale doesn't really matter. By changing the animation speed down to 22, you can see we get something a little bit more reasonable. Let's just assume that that is working. And the advantage of hopefully that UV workflow is if we put the rates back up again, then you can see that they are it's like that same animation just slowly moving along, which is pretty powerful. And we get this nice bit of motion. I'm going to scale the, I'm having so much trouble viewing everything. I shall scale the spline down so we can look at these a little more, maybe not that small. And now I can increase the speed, 15. All right, so now you get this independent, they're all flocking. Each of them has a noise applied and they're all moving and they're traveling along the entire path. Okay, that seems fine. That's working pretty well. Now, of course, the immediate thing is they're passing through each other. We don't want that. We can try using the push apart effector. And this is actually like one of the reasons it's made. It's just a set radius right now. The radius is quite large, and it is just radius driven, but 35 seems okay. Let's see what this does as they move around. Yeah, see, this is why this is actually a really good example of why I don't like the push apart. It's only applicable in very specific circumstances. Now, if we increase the number of iterations, it might smooth it out, but I kind of doubt it. Yeah, because the push apart is coming after the randomness. So as one shape, I'm not even going to explain this very well, be able to explain it very well, but you can imagine if we have a cube here, and let's just make a sphere to distinguish. So I've got a cube and a sphere. So if the sphere was on this side of it and the push apart is saying, oh, keep them all apart, then the cube is going to, let's say, jump 50 units one way and the sphere is going to push 50 units the other way to keep them separated. But we're randomly introducing all this animation in it. So with no push apart, the random is saying like this is drifting here and here and here. It's going all over the place, but let's keep it two-dimensional. So they're drifting like this. Now, the push apart, what's going to happen, and it's logical it does this, but when the sphere's on this side, it's going to be like, oh, you have to stay 100 units away from it. But as soon as the thing it's being fed crosses over to here, suddenly it's going to be like, oh, you're supposed to be 100 over here. Oh, you crossed this threshold, you're supposed to be 100 over here. And so the push apart is inherently going to get this pop introduced into it. So with that in mind, look at the way, just by adding this push apart, when you look at what it's doing, you see how it's getting that pop. Bing, 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 as these pass by each other, it's trying to recalibrate them and scoot them away. So the push apart effector does not work in this type of circumstance. Now, what I think what I really like doing in this type of circumstance, and let's see, what is going to be the best way to do this? They're all forced to line up. So here's what I am thinking. What if we made some capsule shapes? And it will also be along Z. Temporarily, I'm going to turn off the cloner so we can see everything's over here. So the capsule's here, and you see there's our arrow. So I'm going to make the capsule big enough to encapsulate the arrow. And let's make sure that the arrow is entirely inside of the capsule. Let's just say that's kind of its own little personal, like, bubble, its own little territorial space. It controls that amount of area. Nothing can get closer to it than that. So if that is the case, we can say this capsule, well, we don't want to see it and we don't want it to render. So what's the best way to do this? I'm going to hit Alt-G. This is going to be a little bit weird of a dynamic setup, but I've been doing this more and more lately. I have a tutorial coming out that's going to talk about some of these things. I want this entire null to become a dynamic object. So simulation, rigid body. If I say this is a compound collision shape, this entire thing, including the null, are all being counted as a single dynamic object. Obviously, this capsule is the only thing that's actually the proper shape, and everything else is redundant. Now, these are all really simple geometry, so that would just work. If we were inclined to, though, I could duplicate my dynamics tag onto this cone and go under dynamics, turn off enabled, and now it is a child of a dynamic object, and it itself has been turned off. So it's not part of that calculation, but it's still a child of a null that is, which means it has to go wherever that one says, which means if I play, it should just fall, and you see that the cone is moving with it. So the only thing calculating is the capsule shape. And if you ever do anything in video game software, capsules are like the most common shape, where it's kind of it's kind of like it's an elongated sphere, and a lot of characters can be kind of, you can't make a character be a sphere, but you could kind of say, oh, it's a big capsule shape. All right. Having done all that, we can hide the capsule and just see our arrow, but we know that the capsule is actually what's dynamically doing things. Putting that inside the cloner and turning it on, we're going to get, let's go find it on the spline. Doesn't want to zoom in for me. It's really offset there for my own sanity. I will reset the spline to 0, 0, 0, so we're a little more centered. Now, keep in mind, these are all dynamic objects, and they're going to be super intersecting. In fact, there's a good chance we want, and you can see if I turn it on, there's a good chance we want the radius of this to be a lot smaller. So let's shrink these up so that they, they don't fight past each other too much. And now make it invisible again. Keep in mind, those are all dynamic. If we apply, I think it'll just fall. Yeah. Of course, if we set our magical setting of under the dynamic tag inside of force, turn on a follow position and follow rotation. 5 is usually a good number to start out with. In this case, they might drift a lot, but they'll try and be in that position. So they're trying to go where it told it, and you see that they're all clustered up. The cool thing is you'll see that they're not intersecting with each other. The position's actually really good right now. The rotation is not quite adapting as quickly as I want it to. So I'm going to crank that up. Let's try 15. And up at 15, you can see that they're starting to aim the correct direction a lot more. I don't know. You don't want to go too much above 50. That starts getting bad. But now we're at a follow rotation of 25, and that seems pretty good. And you can see now that they're all doing a pretty good job of being clustered together. They are still trying to follow the position, which means this randomness still does count. I want to randomize their position a little bit more. So I'm going to say 250, 250, 250. And now they have a little bit more motion that they want to do. I don't know. Let's keep this loose. But you can see as they all travel around, they're each trying to pick new positions that they want to travel in. I'm not doing this any favors by making these curves quite as tight as they are. But now you can see that they're not colliding with each other because they're not colliding because they are dynamic. They can't pass through each other. Potentially there's improvements we can make via using things like drag. I don't know how well this will work, but if we put in, maybe not drag, but lift. Lift starts caring a lot about the angle. And this could, well, it's going to slow it down, but it's probably going to make them want to very much aim the correct direction. And that is going to want them to be very straight. If these were actually arrow shapes and not cones, it'd work even better because the aerodynamically speaking, the cone would be trying to go forward. Potentially their axis also counts, but I don't want to go too far in those directions. But now you can see we get the drifting, all of them moving around, and they want to approximately be in this location. Now there's a couple other advantages you actually get naturally. Now, let me think. There's actually a few. I don't want to go too in depth because there's a bunch of cool concepts here. There's a couple other concepts we could potentially do where one of these objects is trying to follow position, the other one is connected and kind of getting dragged behind, so it would very much have an orientation to it. That type of thing could be pretty cool. Now, this is entirely a cloner setup. There are no keyframes right now, so this is still pretty neat. Another advantage to the setup is because they are now dynamic, we could put in some sort of obstacle on the line. I'll just go to a top view so I can very precisely place this. So that's right on the line where a bunch of them are going to want to go, giving that cylinder a collider body. When these come up to it, they're going to collide with it and then slide around it. A good idea would be to give this 0 friction. So with 0 friction, they should just slide past it very smoothly. You see all of them go around it. So it's like, okay, it's pretty cool out of the gate for a no keyframe, pretty clean setup overall, just with some of these dynamics. And that's working quite nicely. Now, flocking. I would kind of say, okay, this is one setup and it works quite well. And we could have been doing this back in like R 12.5. We've been able to do this for a while. Obviously, another approach we can take, and I know some of them are twisting around behind a little bit more than I want them to. I do feel like I don't want to just keep cranking up the follow rotation. So that would go into the more dynamic rig where I would make something heavy in the front and then the tail would get left behind. And that could do a pretty good job of it, actually. I kind of just don't want to go that route right now. Saving this file as number 2A flocking, we can attempt to spend a little bit of time flocking cloner. We can spend a little bit of time attempting to make this based on field forces instead of all the things we're currently doing. And if that was the case, this cloner would indeed go back to something like the grid array. So they're all very close to each other. In fact, with this randomness, the per step could be dropped down to 0. And now the randomness is just pushing them apart. They would still be dynamic, and they're not going anywhere. So if I just hit play, they should just kind of float around and bump into each other. You can see how they do bump. In fact, I didn't think about it, but we should have gotten rid of... This should have 0 bounce and 0 friction, and they should more smoothly slide past each other, in theory anyway. Now, these are dynamic objects that are being told to follow their position. In fact, and now I don't even want them following their position. So we might end up having to make that rig I was avoiding. In fact, we don't want this random anymore. I mean, maybe we do, maybe we don't. Anyway, suffice to say, we've got a clone here with a bunch of them here play. They're all going to explode from where they are. I don't want it to follow the position anymore either. So under its dynamics tag, get rid of follow position. And now we could feed this through. I guess we do want some separation on them now. Let's just reset. That makes them pretty far apart. I'll cheat and just scale the cloner down. Put them back in. It's quicker than changing all the numbers. They're still colliding a little bit, but that'll fix themselves. So those will all just fall apart. And actually, look at the way that they move. This is actually kind of neat. I wonder if we can do this. Do you see how, because we still have the drag on there, do you see how they definitely have like this drifting type of look? I wonder if we could offset their center of balance and make them kind of go head first. That'd be pretty neat. So in this case, I thought we got rid of the bounce and friction. I must have put in the wrong tag or undone it. If we were to go to no, it's under mass. If we turn on mass, turn on a custom center, we want to scoot this forward or backward, probably forward, and we're on Z, so positive Z. So in this case, how big is that cylinder? It is about 100 long, which is a good number. So offsetting on Z, 50 units would, I think, put the axis up near the tip of it. If that is indeed the case, if we hit play, then the hope would be that the front is heavier, and you can see all these falling down like lawn darts. Like they're just going, pew, like falling down because their center, no matter what they're doing, they're all going to attempt to aim downward. And that's all thanks to lift, which is, that's now, I don't know if that's actually going to carry through when it comes to this motion, but if it does, it'll be really neat. So all of that is the case. Turn off gravity, Control or Command D, dynamics, general, gravity 0. Now we need a field force, and that will be, it's not applying to anything out of the gate. So simulate, forces, field force, our nice field force here. I don't want any display for now. Actually, I would like to use a field force as show a display here to illustrate what's going on. If we place this carefully on the spline, then you'll be able to see a little bit more clearly what's going on. That's the hope anyway. That should hopefully give us an okay cross section. So it's probably not big enough, so I'll increase that. All right, so that is our bounding box on the field force. It's going to give us information. Feeding in the spline itself, it's going to try and travel along the spline. If I were to zoom up on this, you see all of these look like they're angled along the spline. These actually have an inherent fall off. I don't want that. So under offset in the field force, cranking that up, it's going to give it full power all the way. And you see that this entire box is filled up with that. Now, immediately you're going to see that this is traveling everywhere. If I were to select this and enlarge, you're going to see that no matter where this crosses over, you can see it's adopting the direction that's nearest the line, and it's applying a force in that direction. So actually, just out of the gate, because this is pretty much infinite, let's just see what this does. Now, currently this is adding to the velocity, and you see that they're beginning to, actually they're seeming to turn and have the correct orientation. So this might work better than I thought it would. The add to velocity is really weak right now. Gravity is 40, so let's make this the same as gravity. So I've really cranked this up, so there's a really strong force here. And as they travel along, they're actually automatically adopting the direction because we made the front of them heavier. Now, immediately they're getting this, like I said, this goes off to infinity, so they're free to travel upward if they want to. We don't want them to freely travel upward. We want them to follow this line really, really closely. Now, some of that drag and force might be trying to stop them from turning. So there's a couple of variables we might need to deal with. But before we worry about that, let's begin to make these also be attracted to the line itself. We can do that by dragging in a second spline. This time, the spline it's currently set to a long, but I shall set it to radius. And I only want to see that one. So turning on radius, it's a very small radius right now. As I increase, you can see that there's actually a radius traveling along the entire thing. And as it gets near this radius, it's got some power, and it's saying, hey, go closer to the spline. Now, because we've got a relatively large scene here, I think it's a good idea to increase this a lot. In fact, I mean, we can kind of go out to infinity by making this really large. It's just getting attracted to these lines no matter what. With the other one turned off, I would think that we're just getting attraction to the line directly. And you'll see now that if it overshoots it, it's just kind of circling around, no matter what it's trying to get to that line. So that's working pretty well. It wants to stay near the line. So let's turn on the second one and add these two forces together. So now it wants to stay near the line and travel along it. So the turn radius is definitely causing us a little bit of trouble. It might be, the lift is doing a good job for us, but I think that there's so much power in the lift that it can't turn very quickly. So that's something we're fighting here. So this lift is strong. I'm going to lower it down to 5. And let's see what happens. Well, I think we also need to drain, even down at 5, the direction is still working really well. This is adding energy to the scene, so they're constantly getting more added. What we need to do is start draining energy out from it. Very typically, if you're using the field force and you're adding to the velocity, then we probably want to drain energy out from the system. And the best way to do that is a friction. So this friction is constantly draining energy out, and then this force is adding it back in again. And as soon as I added a little bit of friction, you see it suddenly is behaving kind of the way we were expecting it to. So now those are traveling along. They're doing an okay job. I want more of that lift because that seemed to be doing a really good job as far as facing the arrow correctly. Ooh, look at that. Almost immediately, those are doing a really nice job. Now, something we're seeing is that they're constantly trying to aim for that center line in a very distinct way. So as they fight each other and they're trying to get near that line, they're angling a lot. I don't want them to do that. I'm not even sure what the best way to fix that is. We have this effect adding in, so it's kind of saying, hey, pull towards the line, which is neat. And we could just, with the friction on here, we probably even just turn that off entirely. You see they are going to start following the line, but you'll see that if they get further away from the line, they'll stay further away. Nothing's pulling them in. So I could turn it back on, immediately see they do return to the line. We might need to just start pulling the power back. We can do that just by pulling this down a little bit. And maybe there's a happy medium here where they want to be near the line, but they're not constantly angling like really harshly towards the line. And we have to find that balance because you see they are getting a little bit away from the line. It takes them a while to turn into it. So there's got to be a nice, well, hopefully there's a nice balance point there where they're not overly aiming there. They're also bouncing into each other, which could be creating a lot of that motion. But yeah, that's doing a pretty nice job of them all traveling. The tighter we make this want to follow that line, the more that they're going to line up and not be in a big cluster. So yeah, several variables for us to keep in mind there. We're looking pretty good. Now, there's so many things that start layering on top of all of this. Well, first of all, the starting point for the flock is making it so they all kind of scatter all over the place. If I were to, which direction do they travel? Maybe that is a good idea. Yeah, that's a little better. So they start out and they'll start traveling along. That's interesting. The field force calculates if the axis is on screen. So as soon as the axis goes off the screen, it disappears. I didn't know that. So those are moving around. They're doing an okay job. Inside the field force, we could create a random field. And the random field will also add on top of everything else. It has all the same rules we had before. This is a big cloud of noise. Currently, it is applying. It's not animating, but they themselves are passing through it quite a bit. If we were to turn these off, we would probably see them. This is kind of what the random is currently doing. It looks like the random is very small relative to what we're seeing. So increasing the size of that. You can see these are behaving a little bit more consistently, but we're traveling through a big cloud of it. So I think making it quite large might be a good idea. Maybe not. So let's feed those all back in again and see what the overall effect of this randomness added on top. And immediately I do feel like there was a little, you see how some of those went up and down. So there's kind of a nice, I just kind of want to say flocking motion going on there. That's pretty nice with it being big. And they all moved, they're actually doing a pretty good job there. I like it. The spline probably crosses a little near itself, so these really big fields are making it so that they might cross from one line to another, where really it should travel around to the other side. So I'll just give them even more space. That's fine. So yeah, we got that noise being random. Of course, we're all passing through that big cloud of noise. We have the ability to change anything we want. We could give that cloud of noise speed, like 22%. They'll keep it alive, but you won't see any jitter. So it's a go-to of mine. And now that noise will give they'll give them a little bit of motion, just keep them a little bit more alive. And it's looking pretty good. I like that. Now, one of the things we're seeing is that actually right now they are clustering up quite a bit, surprisingly, but they're not flocking in like a really tight cluster. And I'm not even sure if there's a good way to do that. Yeah, kind of given the general workflow that we're doing right now. So I have two thoughts. Well, one, I just don't know. We haven't saved this one, so let's save this as our flocking B. We have possibly two methodologies. I don't know if it's going to work, because one thought would be, what if we drag the cloner in itself as something, and it can be brought in as a spline object, a point object, or a MoGraph object? In my experience, I think you need it to be a point object. MoGraph I was told it's something really specific. It's not terribly useful. Actually, it might only be for like text objects or something. So feeding it a point, they become a series of little independent radiuses, which are really small. As I increase, actually, we'll turn everything off again. So now we're only seeing these independent radiuses. There's an inherent problem with it that is not very intuitive, though. And let me think if I can even explain it properly. The problem with them each having their own little independent radius is that they just kind of combine into each other, so they can't really affect each other directly because they're being affected by their own radius, if that makes sense. Like as soon as they cross into a different one, they'll automatically get affected by it. Now, the way that these all just popped away, I'm not sure if those are updating properly. They do seem to have kind of scooted away from each other. Now, maybe they do end up having an effect on the way that I just don't have a good intuition for this. So I'm going to invert the direction. And if this is working, then what that should mean is they're all trying to be like attracted to each other. And you see they're all stuck on top of each other. And so this might actually be an attraction where they're all saying, no, we want to stay near each other. Increasing the radius here. So if they drift far away, there's still enough of radius to say, no, pull back in. Maybe these are all get additively added together. I just don't know. In theory, they're getting attracted to each other right now. So they should try to do some sort of clustering. So that being added on top of all these other effects might keep them clustered together. But I just don't know. I don't know for sure. I gotta say, they look like they're trying to stay clustered together, and I didn't think that would work that well. But it seems to be doing all right. Turn off the display temporarily. Yeah, but then they all suddenly went apart from each other. So I don't know. And my understanding would be that wouldn't do much. So that was one thought. And I kind of didn't think it would work at all. Turning that off, the other thought is the completely separate object, the dynamic force object. So by creating this is, and actually you can see it right away, these are getting attracted to each other. In fact, they're getting incredibly clustered together. So this just makes objects and particles, dynamic objects, all get attracted to each other directly. So it's kind of like they're all little magnets and they get pulled in. So they're definitely clustering in. We have quite a fairly large radius in here, and I'm even inclined to increase it more. This is very dependent on the mass or density of the object. Having said that, it's really strong right now. It's inverse square. If we keep lowering it, and we probably have to go very low, like 0.01, to the point where they the idea is we want them to generally be attracted to each other. They want to stay near each other in general, but we don't want them, it to be so strong that they're like all just getting attached. So we'll try going to 0.1. And yeah, you see that it's both too much and almost too little, so I'm not sure about that. And of course, that one group escapes right away. You see how clustered that these want to be. So yeah, it's kind of a little push and pull on that. In addition to that, I really like the force object. An additional thing that I do with this sometimes is this will be the positive attraction. I'll make a duplicate of it, and let's make this one a negative attraction. This one will be 10 times stronger, so they're all getting attracted way stronger. However, we'll make it a negative force, so it's actually pushing them apart from each other, and now you do see the effect right away. You see them all get pushed apart. So that's neat. The idea here is, though, we're going to shrink that distance a lot. So there's a really strong thing saying like, oh, if we're really close to each other, we don't want to be that close. So by shrinking this radius really small, the thought is when they get far apart, they're trapped in this bigger radius that says, no, get closer. But then if we set this radius properly, then when they get too close to each other, they'll get pushed apart by an even stronger effect. I'm trying to find that balance point. It's hard to guess the radiuses here. Yeah, okay, actually, yeah, look at that. Do you see how they fling apart and then they got too close, so they pushed apart from each other? So these two forces in combination with each other are going to say, stay near each other, but if you get nearer than this amount, then there's an even stronger force pushing them away. Now, they are drifting apart from each other a little bit, but especially in the beginning, you'd see how they're attracted in, but you see and then, they really shoot off there. But of course, if I turn off this negative amount, I think you'll see the individual points like cluster up on top of each other more. And actually, now that I think about it, if we have this negative force, then we could probably increase this one so they get really tightly pulled in, and then the negative force can just be more than it. So they're going to be really inclined to cluster, but they can't cluster too closely to each other. But now we're just kind of guessing and checking some various forces. Like that seems okay. Oh man, well, some of this cluster right now is behaving amazingly, at least for a little bit. So there's a lot of variables here. Actually, that did a really nice job. So maybe the stronger one is doing something. And I'm feeling a pretty decent amount of flocking right now. In fact, the entire group is sticking together quite nicely. They don't want to get too close, but they don't want to get far apart because of those two forces. So there's a lot of things being layered up in here. And what's neat here, obviously, is that this is there must be something weird with the way the fields interact in that area because they always get churned up. But of course, they're not sticking on the line overly. And we already talked about the various things that are causing that to happen. But I gotta say, this is actually pretty good. I'm kind of impressed that it's working as well as it is. There's a bunch of pretty neat looking general flocking behaviors on here. Given the variables we fed in, I feel like we can probably increase this random. So if we go under direction, we could crank up the strength, make the random 3 times stronger. Let's just see if that gives us anything visual. I mean, clearly that broke off and those spun around. So yeah, this random might be doing too much now. But in general, they should still want to follow the line, but the random definitely is influencing the direction that they get pulled. So yeah, you got to be careful with that. But you can see now that they all want to move around. But let's just call that too strong. I'm going to weaken it back down again. And you saw all the different things we have to play with. If I increase the power of them getting attracted to that center spline, and it's a good idea to rename these. Like this one is the spline radius, and this one is the spline along. In some ways you can combine those, but I like keeping them separate just as having like separate controls on them. But now, yeah, with this being strong, you see they're all being attracted to that line a little bit more closely, and they're being forced to travel around. So yeah, a lot of push and pull. And if we're going to not be in the world of particles, I kind of, there's more tweaking that we could do, but this is about as good as you can. Well, the line attractions may be a little strong now. We could change the fall offs on those, but this is pretty good. I'm overall pleased with the way these are behaving. The overall radius attracting them to that line is pretty powerful. So I might make the negative push stronger so they don't want to get on top of each other quite as much. Wow, that helped a lot. I just went from 2 to 3, and it was a significant thing to stopping them from really colliding with each other. And there we go. Now we've got a really nice looking combination of what's a pretty good flocking. And in addition to that, keep in mind this is fully dynamic, so it's got the other same principles that we had. Being it being fully dynamic, we can make like a little donut shape here that they have to try and travel through, making that a collider body. In fact, we probably need to, yeah, it's a static mesh. It's really smart these days. Get rid of all of its bounce and whatnot. As this travels around and they approach it, they're going to be forced to go through it or around it. I think most of them will go through it. Let's make it a little more challenging and shrink it. So they should all collide and be like, oh no, but they're just continuing to essentially do their flocking behavior, but they had to get through that object. So you can make them interact with objects in the scene. And you could probably even make some sort of net or bucket and like scoop them up, and they'll be forced to move with those dynamic objects. So there's a lot of cool combinations and things to keep in mind as this goes. And if you were to just take these models and the same way we told the, this cone is put in there to just go along for the ride, not to be dynamic, swap that out for like a swimming fish animation, and these would all just be swimming along doing a flocking, and we can create exactly as many as we want. In fact, I wasn't even tinkering with that, but I don't know how. Our dynamics are actually quite clean right now, so we're still running at about 30 frames a second. I was able to create a lot more clones with this big cluster of them. We're going to have an even bigger school of them floating around, as long as they keep their distance from each other. Right now, they're potentially it's a little bit tight, but once again, we did a lot of guessing checking with this force, but it seems to be working well. Increasing that amount a little bit more, they'll probably spread out a little bit more. Yeah, very nice. Yeah, I'm actually quite pleased with that. That's working better than I thought we'd get to in a cloner type of situation. So yeah, very happy with that. So that is 2B flocking cloner, and it's pretty nice. All righty, back to the chat, and we'll see if what we can do. Lots of Connor, who asked the original question, was saying that particles also sound interesting. Could you attach animated geometry to each particle? Well, yeah, each particle could be represented via an entire object. I'm not going to go into any of that right now, but yeah, any particle could be a bunch, whatever geometry you wanted it to be. 2wax, welcome. Nelson, Mick, Gift, lots of people coming hanging out. I'm going to jump to Twitch for the next question. Crystal surface growing and waving from Emicor. That sounds interesting. Let's see what we got here. So, it's a Nike commercial, which probably means it's a pretty big budget production. This is from Tendril. So I expect this to be some pretty high-end stuff. Let's see what we get. So specifically the question was saying crystal surface growing and waving. You didn't call out, 21 seconds in. You did call out. Thank you very much for calling a time out. Wow, that's pretty. Shoe commercials, man. Seems where people can, with motion graphics, is just allowed to do whatever the heck they want when it comes to shoe commercials. I'm sure the clients can be obnoxious, but okay. So kind of this, I'm assuming that the effect you're referring to is this crystal-like shockwave traveling through the geometry. That's really cool. In fact, I think that we're going to be able to do this. There's going to be steps to it, but in my head, I can pretty clearly see how we might do something like this. So yeah, very cool animation from Tendril here. Let's create a landscape object. Actually, not something we typically do, but creating a landscape object just as a way of giving us some not flat geometry to work from. So we're essentially making it a little more challenging ourselves. So this becomes what's supposed to be doing that little tendril-y explosion. Or, the shoe had all these little bumps and curves. So that's what we did here. Now, we could create whatever kind of geometry on top of it we want. We can also just use a copy of the original geometry, which is probably a good idea. Copy and paste the landscape. First thing we need to do is get this thing probably randomly triangulated somehow. There's definitely various ways of doing it. What way do I want to do now? One of my go-tos, it can get a little bit messy, but one of my go-tos, polygon reduction used to be a way of doing it. And let's see what actually that does. There's two different polygon reductions, and I know officially from Axon, they replaced the old polygon reduction with this new one, which is more of a generator object, not a deformer. I got to tell you, I like the old one. The old one just does things the new one doesn't. And they hid it, but you can still get to it by searching for reduction. And you can see that there's still the deformer version, so I can still pull in this reduction deformer. And let's hide the original. And I can see it's doing a really great job of giving us these triangles. And it's just, I don't know, I just like the type of results we get. Now, what we actually want to do is, well, it's really cool, is we can parametrically turn them into triangles with that by not reducing the strength. And if we start reducing it just a little bit, let's get rid of, what's a good amount? As soon as we get to around, 25, 30, then now we start really getting all these individual triangles going. So that works well. But there's a lot of things we could layer together. One of my, let's see if this works. This is maybe silly, but we're just having fun here. I know I'm doing something dangerous, so immediately saving it. Crystal Shockwave. That's a cool name. It's like a band name. Okay, here's the landscape. If I were to create a bevel, hopefully this works. I've been having trouble with the bevel lately. The bevel deformer, set it to point mode, and every single point is getting deformed like this. Turning on limit will stop them, hopefully, from passing past each other. And as I increase this, you can now see that it's, actually, it didn't do too much because it just inverted the overall effect. So you can see that I've inverted the geometry, so it's running at 45-degree angle. It did work this time, so at least that's a thing. Now we could increase it, and you can end up with some really cool, weird-looking geometry. So I'm trying to throw out there that there are some neat options you can do. Look at this crazy-looking geometry that we just threw in here. And let's say that, I'm actually kind of inclined to, let's say this will be the crystal explosion, because it's kind of this cool pattern. The more we subdivide, the more we might get different patterns inside of it. Changing the radius will change a lot. Now it is choking a little bit, I think. No, it's doing fine. I guess I just increased it a lot. It's subdivided to whatever extent, but we don't want that many subdivisions, so I'll just allow it to do something like that. That's looking good. There are intersecting points right now that are on top of each other, so given what I just did, I would throw this entire thing into a connect object that does have the weld turned on, so this has cleaned up all that geometry, and any effects we do should be to the connect. Now, all of that was just going to be a start so that we could then throw in our polygon reduction. And you see the polygon reduction is in the connect. So it's going to be working from the result of the connect object, turning that on. And it might take a while to chug along. We can always make this editable. Hopefully. Well, I did save it because I knew I was doing dangerous things here. It's calculating for a while, but we are throwing a lot of weird geometry at it. So it might be a little confused. It gave me control for a second there, but it's not giving me a result, which worries me a little bit. So I'm going to turn it off and hopefully it wakes up. If not, I just saved it. Yeah, it's still turned off, luckily. So that was one method, would be to reduce the polygons. And now we've made kind of a cool looking pattern, which is also neat. In addition, keep in mind, the next one I was going to mention is the connect object itself. If we're welding, we could start increasing the weld distance. And I'm not sure what the distances are in the scene. I think they're reasonable. So as I increase this, yeah, and once we get to a certain point, it's going to start welding these individual points together. So I'll try with something like 1.5. The problem is that they're all very uniform, so we're going to end up with very uniform patterns. If this was a little more chaotic, it would probably do a better job for us. And keep in mind our overall order of operations. There's a lot of things potentially we could have been doing. Just for fun, I'm going to temporarily turn off the connect. And then before the bevel calculates, what if we do a polygon reduction and then try the bevel? Because that looks pretty crazy. And I don't know what this will do, but let's turn on the bevel. So now it's trying to bevel all those shapes. And now look at, actually, I really like this. Look at how crystalline that almost inherently looks. Like, that's pretty cool. Then, now that it's done that crystalline shape, which I will save because it looks really neat. Now that it's done that, if I turn the connect back on, this connect now has this larger tolerance and it'll start welding more points together. Now, I actually like the effect we're getting, but if I increase it, you can see you get more welds. That is a little bit dangerous by itself, though, because you can see, well, you see the mesh can start messing up, and you see that some of them are passing by each other. We're getting some bad polygons, and then we're getting some like polygon holes. So you have to use a light touch on that. In any case, I actually really like the end result that we get right here. So we'll keep that. We do want to put this into the connect, but we want the weld to be back to its default. So that does weld it down to a single object that we now have control over, and it looks really, really cool. Saving that, we're in a good spot. Call this the crystal, and we have the original landscape. Technically, I guess I'll make the original landscape visible and scoot it down just a little bit, so this entire thing is offset. Now, moving it down is going to work for us here. Technically, we could have also inflated it or pushed it off the surface as well with another deformer, and I think that would also work nicely. Just, I'm going to throw this onto the landscape, the actual ground, just so that we can have, you know, a different color down there. And we'll make the crystals nothing fancy. Let's give them a yellowish tint, and let's add some reflectance in. Remove, add GGX. Yeah, that's cool. Make them a little bit blurry, and this should just give us some reflection to pop out and make it look a little bit fancier, perhaps. So now we've got this welding all those different points together. At this point, I think the easiest thing we can do, and it should run quite quickly, is a MoGraph PolyFX. PolyFX is so great because it doesn't generate a bunch of separate objects. It's still being treated as a single object. Putting in the PolyFX, I think absolutely nothing's going to happen. But now I can actually move every single individual polygon. And in spite of how many there are, look at how relatively quickly this is running. It's pretty great. Now remember, Z is usually the direction that means forward in Cinema. So Z is going to be one of our magical properties here. But we've also got scale. It's a PolyFX. So, and it's a MoGraph object. With that in mind, of course, we can feed it effectors. In this case, it wants a plane effector. The plane effector is going to move everything. We don't want to move anything right now. We do want to scale things. Scale it in a uniform, absolute way, -1. So everything's shrinking down to 0. All individual polygons have shrunk to nothing. Now, inside of that plane effector, we can give it a shape to control. We actually have a reason to potentially use a torus shape. In some ways, I think a torus shape is not the best idea, but we get so few opportunities to use it. I think I will. Creating this torus shape, we can drag it up, and now you can see as the torus intersects the various places, it is erasing them out. In this case, we want the opposite effect to happen. Now, we have two options. We can go into remapping and click invert, and that's valid. We can also create a invert modifier layer, and that will invert it as well. And now it only exists where the torus is. Now, like I said, the torus might not end up being the best example because there's so much height map on here that it's escaping out the top and escaping out the bottom. So maybe not the best, but yeah, still pretty neat. The effect happens in here. So I love that we could temporarily use the torus, but I don't think it's going to work for us. So let's create a cylinder field. A little more boring, but we can make it very tall. I wish you can just make them like infinitely tall. That'd be neat, because there's not much in the way of control on it. You just have your overall scale. Oh no, I'm sorry. You get the height and width, but there's an inherent fall off. So I usually just like add a bunch of zeros to the height, so it's kind of infinity there. Now, of course, the cylinder just has a inside and then outside. However, going into remapping, we can say, actually, where this range is transitioning, we want a curve, and that shall transition from nothing to just where the middle is. So that little random transition is now actually transitioning in and then out again. And now we get the donut shape, but it's infinite from this, it's kind of projected down, which means it's really easy to grab the cylinder and just increase the radius. And as I do, we get that effect transitioning through. So that's inherently working quite nicely. And I don't even know that there's that much craziness to do from here. Now that we've got a fall off that we can use to drive things, we didn't even have to invert it because we controlled it via the spline. Actually, it's not true. Everything is sort of inherently inverted in here. It's just something to keep in mind. It's scaling everything down outside of that. So we do have to keep that kind of thing in mind, where we sort of want the opposite effect. Keeping that in mind, because we know that's an inverted effect, I'm going to rename this one plane scale, and then selecting the PolyFX, create a second plane effector. And this one, I want it to do kind of everything else. So in this case, let's do a position, and we'll keep it mild. Let's push it up on Z, and you see all of these are now pushing upward on Z. That's fine. I just wanted to do that to visually see it. Now it's technically pushing everywhere. I don't want to push everywhere. I want to only push where the cylinder is telling it to. However, if I turn that on, you see that it's actually the outsides of that are being affected, and that's because that is inverted. But I was able to drag that same cylindrical field in, and now I can invert that result. And now you'll see that it's actually the middle parts that are getting to get offset and the outer parts are actually the ones that are stuck on the ground. So we have very direct control over that. So this will be the one that is a little bit more precise. We can push these up a little bit, and we could independently scale this. So I could do another, we could even do a random scale. Let's do a, let's say absolute, so they all do the same, but we can say negative 0.25, so they can get to about the quarter of the size and all axes. One of them is not, probably Z, but that's fine. I can see that they've all randomly shrunk down a little bit. And actually, it's not true. It's a plane effector, so they're not randomly scaling them. They're uniformly scaling down on each of their individual axes. So it is maybe a good idea to do a plane effector on here, but to tell you the truth, let's turn off that plane effector and kind of just do everything I mentioned, but with a random effector. So it's randomly pushing things out. And even that's fine. Let's do a little X, a little Y, and then more Z. We'll do 5 on Z. Scale, not uniform, but yes, absolute, negative 25, negative 25, negative 25. So now those are all randomly pushing. And we need it to have that same fall off. So cylindrical field, invert. And now you see all those are applied on this random. Now, I might have used a little bit of a heavy touch on that. So we'll go there, a little more mild, 0.5, 0.5. And that still might be a little too much, but let's just rock with that for now. And then, depending on the way you want them to move, we could just randomly apply some rotation here. The way these get calculated, I think it's probably in a very absolute way. So I'd be inclined to just do maybe like a 45 degrees. Actually pushes, it kind of kills the effect. I don't want to even go look at the reference again, because I'm not trying to recreate exactly what they did. Just talk about some techniques so you can make what you want yourself. So, and honestly, we don't want them to break apart that much. This this effect is being told to reapply, like apply strongly here and not on the outside. But of course, those crystals were supposed to sort of appear. Yeah, I'm not sure how I'd specifically want that, because those are all scaling down, but we could remap it on any given one of them. So it could very sharply have these pieces appear in these sections. Now in this case, we don't want to change the original cylindrical remapping. So we can just, oops, don't invert that. That's going to look crazy. I could just add a curve on top of it, and now we can remap things based on this curve. I think if I scoot this in, nope, it's the opposite. If I scoot the bottom over, we're actually tightening, we're actually kind of clamping it. It's almost like we're saying the brightness goes out, and you see I'm scaling them all pretty much to their maximum scale. So they just suddenly appear, but you'll see that those are a lot flatter because they haven't gotten the randomness applied to them yet. And the randomness slowly will get applied as it travels in. So we can remap the individual effects on the individual objects. So along those lines, in the random, I could also create a curve. Now, it's happening after the invert, so I think it probably would be the opposite. So let me grab the top one. Actually, I was pushing them out, so maybe it is the bottom one again. Yeah, so you can see as I pull this that the effect is saying don't only do it in the very center point. You can see how it's pinching that in more. So by pulling this across, I could say, actually, this outside don't really get affected, and then it'll start shattering up more here. And of course, as it fades out, it's going to return to its original position. That's another option you have for, you could control an in and out. Right now, we're just using the same effect to fade in and fade out. So let's just, I'm just going to leave it at that. Let's say that's the effect that I want. Obviously, if you want to give this thickness, you could throw the entire thing into a cloth NURBS. I don't want to. So, and I don't expect this to run that fast. In fact, we're not seeing that much of the area. So I'm going to make this a little bit easier on ourselves and drop the segment count to 50 by 50 and then cut the size down in half and the width. So everything should be relatively smaller. Maybe it's a little bit more rocky, but there's more. It's just going to run quicker for us. So now we've got that lovely cylindrical field. I'm trying to find, grab this outer dot, and now you can see, actually, because I shrink it, really easy to grab this and go, and now we get this crystalline effect that'll just spread out through the entire thing. Now, keep in mind, it is based on the overall radius, so you might need to counter animate the fall off. So if you wanted it to maintain a size, you might need to shrink this. You could also just automatically make it smaller or larger. And this goes back to us saying, I love the PolyFX just because of how quick it calculates, because this is still being treated as one object. Cinema doesn't like a lot of objects, but it does not mind one object that's got a lot of pieces. So we get this effect traveling really quickly. And we have the ability to have this do whatever we want. In fact, here, I would probably be inclined to give the randomness a little bit of animation. Like these are all very static. So changing this to be noise-based. Yeah, we can do that. Let's say it's noise-based, indexed. So each one is calculating independently. It's got a decent animation speed. I want it to be maybe a little slower. And we do have a scale. Actually, the scale doesn't matter when they're indexed, so that has no effect. The noise might make the overall effect look a little bit lessened overall. So we could just crank up the strength as a way of compensating. Got to go easy on that, though. You got to be careful. If I push too far, it's going to sink below the ground as well. Yeah, so we can let those shatter like that. And there should be an inherent, actually, if I play, you should see that these have like a little bit of life to them independently because they're indexed. So simple as that, because we only have a single field object. We can, let's even just do a quick keyframe. Keyframe that 0, go to the end, have it, I mean, I guess we could do the entire range. It might be, this is probably gonna be way fast, but let's see what we get. Oh, did I, that was weird. Didn't I keyframe it at 0? Maybe I didn't change the time. Let's keyframe it there. You're going to 0, go to 0, keyframe. Oh, I must have misclicked. So now we can see that nice little shockwave travel. We're running at about a third the frames that we want. Hit NB, and we can even visually hide the field, so we just see the end result. Now, like I said, you can add thickness. There's some transparency on here. It could be crossfading, and alpha could be making it fade in and out as well. We could be controlling the color. These could be, I kind of want them to be moving outward as well. So we did make that plane. Let's see how well I can make this work. If we go to this midpoint, we had this plane, and that plane was also fed that same cylindrical field. If we tell that plane to push these outward, oh yeah, randomly, oh yeah, it's doing scale. Oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong plane. Make this push upward there. Yeah, that's all I wanted. So it can all fly upward a little bit more. We just don't want doing anything with scale. Upward. So yeah. And yeah, remapping that in various ways would be pretty cool. I think if they all flew upward more, that'd probably add a little bit more to the effect for my money. But there's a lot of options here. It runs quite nice, quite quickly. I like it. Now, I will save this. Visually, I think it looks a little bit nicer here. Although I do want to push that randomness out more, but whatever. I'll do it. In fact, I want that to be stronger there, so I'll pull this up and scoot this right there. Nice. So save it right there, and I think we have time to get one more shorter question in. So I hope everybody liked it. Let's just catch up on the chat. JM, yep, PolyFX, super important. Questions. Mo Extrude, it can be pretty powerful with what it does as well. Create a delay. Actually, I wasn't even thinking about that, but Emicore, those have to be applied on a per effect basis. Actually, it's not true. We could just, I very rarely use it, but we could use the old delay here, which is set currently to blend. But if we were to give that a spring, what would that do? Is that applied? It's kind of hard to tell if it's applied or not. I mean, it's there, and it should be affecting everything. Yeah, okay, this is definitely a visual effect, but yeah, turning on a bunch of springiness, you can see that's introducing a lot of extra chaos and ripples as it travels up and down. It's probably even passing through the original landscape. If we visually hide that, we might see a little bit more of the effect. And even that, look at that, it's pretty cool. And that's just using a regular delay. We could delay any effector. Any one of these effectors could be directly applied. We can feed in a little bit of blending, which should smooth out the overall animation. So that should kind of calm down that transition. I don't know that in this case that's not a great usage of it, but it could be interesting in certain if you use it in a more specific way. But yeah, the more spring we give it, the more echoes and layers and whatnot. But yeah, it just adds a lot more to it. So never forget about your delays and your decays. I mean, even that the crystalline effect that we're getting, keep in mind that if we were doing this differently, if we applied some sort of growth, like all the growth effects we do, this could actually be growing and leaving this effect behind, and that would be remembered. Currently, we're doing it as a shockwave, but it could be an effect that's grown and remembered in specific spots. It could stay alive in any way. There's a lot of this. This has a lot of potential to be applied in a lot of different ways. Let's see. That was a question from Twitch. So I wouldn't. Well, let me see what we got. Modeling a coffee bag. I don't know. That's not calling too much attention to me, Simon. Sorry. It's pretty standard wrinkle type stuff. At a certain point, you just like use the sculpting tools and push in, push out, and that would do a nice job. It's a fine question. I just don't feel like tackling that as a modeling one. Oh yeah, a gift was just saying that doing it with a vertex and you could use freeze and grow effects, which obviously would be pretty neat. So let's see. Okay, well, it looks like for questions, I'll jump back to Twitch. Java says old question. Cloth wrap something or other. Oh yeah, a bunch of Incarcerator was asking if my recent growth tutorial, the one that came out last week, if that could be applied. And yes, like everything about that could be applied to this effect. Currently, we're driving with a cylinder, but that could be driven via the kind of the light shining on it or the fake light shining on it as from the tutorial. Delays, yeah, lots of good questions as far as this one's concerned. But everybody's looking at me like, oh, there's so much potential here. It's like, yeah, it's a powerful technique you can do a lot with. And then Mick is asking a question about creating this dynamic creature. I gotta say that catches my eye. So this is from Alejandro Echiavery. So let's see what we've got. Blur, 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 blur. Oh my goodness, look at that. Okay, so we kind of got like a amoeba type growth. Somebody asked me a similar question on Instagram recently. It's super crazy. It says it's flip, which I think that would have to be entirely particle based. Those tendrils are intriguing. A lot of it would go when you get those kind of effects. You don't get those for free from MoGraphy type tools. There's more of a behavior built in. So it makes me think that you'd have to go with a fully particle system, or even if you did it with dynamic, and let's say some dynamic tendrils or tentacles, these would need to choose some sort of spot to be like, that's where I want to go. And then you need some mechanism for transitioning from where it currently is to where it wants to go. And those types of things are not trivial. Like there starts getting to be programming involved in that type of thing. These need to choose where they're going and snap to surfaces. And there's a lot of really neat things. It's definitely longer than a half-hour question, but I feel like it's, this is more like I'd have to explore something for like 2 or 3 hours and be like, okay, the concept is there, but it's still fairly advanced. I'm trying to think of even if I were to do it with particles, how I might do it, because there's a lot of really cool behaviors happening here. Oh, well, I wonder if they say, okay, these seem to be sort of unrelated, maybe, but yeah, these are like little fluid explosions. But yeah, see these. Oh yeah, I guess it is similar. So yeah, they're kind of creating this really awesome, gross, nasty creature effect. But yeah, those little individual splats that are being generated are interconnecting back. which makes me think it's like, oh, there's a particle and it's linked to some sort of spline. But you don't want to just shoot out the tentacle and have it connect to nothing. It wants to know where it's going to connect before it gets there. And that's the challenging part. Because you can just, well, potentially with particles, you just be like, oh, fling a particle out and it's interconnecting back to its original object. It's something we can conceive of. But once it connects to said thing, that's a behavior. You can almost imagine, like, you imagine there's like a little cannon here that shoots out the sticky orb and there's a rope attached to it. The cannon fires and it sticks to something. Like, that's a very distinct behavior and connection. And it's not even just a particle thing. A single particle could get shot out, but that has to get reconnected. And if it's leaving a trail of where it went, but it's kind of like that entire trail is a living chain, that starts getting beyond any kind of basic particle stuff. That's for sure. And then even here, you can see they did custom. It says custom goal painting. So it looks like they painted a vertex map, which made it so that this is where the different sticky parts are aiming for. So there's obviously a lot of intelligence built into this reference. Because I've been doing a lot with dynamic, like, connector chains. So even if that were doing what I just said, where it's like, oh, it gets generated randomly, that it had to suddenly come into existence, have a source that's it's tracking, and it would fire that thing and then try and get to where that was going. Like, there's so many steps there. And then you see them just interblobbing. I mean, at least they're interblobbing. Imagine if this tendril didn't interact with that one, but they all blobbed into the original shape, and then you completely lose me. I really like this as a question. It is not... It's definitely beyond our ability to do in this type of live stream, definitely in the half hour. And it'd have to be something I'd have to spend more time exploring. And potentially you have to build in more behaviors and like do at least some decent levels of espresso programming, if not real programming. So it's something to think about. Something to think about for the future. But I do like that as a question. Jelly Diver, what do you got? Potentially a half-hour long question. How would you go about these curving strings? That sounds dangerous. Let's check it out. Metro Tunnel. Ooh. This is from Pixel. All right, Pixel. From Melbourne, Australia. You got your subway tunnels, and then they're all twisting up. Okay, so essentially it's like a nice cartoony rubber band look, almost like they're taffy or a rubber band. Now let's pay attention to what's actually happening here and how real that it is. Actually, it seems surprisingly real-ish. Specifically, I'm looking at this green line. And that does seem to go from inside this shape to fully twisting around there. That's... but... No, yes. Trying to see how fake or real the various parts are. Because you can see... Do you see how, like, very clearly... Like, the purple line is very distinctly wrapping in. The red, very distinctly. Pink, all of these over on this side are very much calling attention. You see that's a bigger shape. So art directing wise, they wanted your eye to be drawn to this area. That's where all the motion's happening. Over here, you have the other part of the line where they feed in. But look how the green line, it just kind of disappears in. And the purple just kind of disappears in. I don't even see where the purple ends up going from there. I guess it maybe... No, I don't even see it really. And then... Like, even this yellow one, it's like, oh, it's kind of, you see how that yellow one's kind of here? But it's like, wait, but that line just continues. So where did that yellow one go in? So is this only real on one side? So they only worried about one side exiting, and the other side could be whatever. And does it even fully loop around? You can see there's a little bit of a magical stretch happening right here. Of course, you don't see this when it's just like 1 second flying by, but there's definitely some deforming happening in some various places that doesn't seem quite as clean. So I think that they might have gotten away with art directing and directing one spot here, but not the entire thing to do the twisting. Now, even with that simplified form, I don't know that I specifically know how to do that, because if you take one specific object, yeah, we can twist it up. I wonder, that's super crazy. I wonder to what degree we just make it kind of for real, which is really a weird maybe way of saying it, but I'm kind of stumped as far as, like, we don't, in cinema, we don't have a deformer that would really do that. A spline wrap could twist something around, like one line could twist around another line, yes, but it couldn't then shoot out the other side and have control over on that. So a thought that I'm having, and I don't know how smart this is, and we're going to simplify, not surprisingly, we need to, for making these things up live. I'm going to simplify, and we're just going to wrap around this circle, okay? But we are going to attempt to have the strands travel in and out in one point. So if I were to do that, what's the best way to do it? I might even use a tracer as a way of creating this initial part. And here is the thought. How would this even work? Let me do a test. If I were to create a matrix object and set it to radial, I'll do this. I'll do the radiuses correctly in a little bit. So we do something like that. Feed that a tracer object and tell it to connect all elements, so those can turn into this ring. If I were to create a second matrix, and this one is set to linear, and we do something like that, if I feed this in as the previous object, how do they connect? Oh, they don't interconnect. We could interconnect them after the fact. Don't trace the vertices. If we say connect all objects, oh, connecting all objects did link it. All right. So this is connecting seemingly its last clone to that. If I were to make another one of these and make it after, then it'll continue from this point. So you can see that I've now got a straight, a circle, and a straight again. So based on this being the concept, if we increase the radius of this to essentially match our circle and make the count whatever we want it to be, we're actually going to get very nice direct control over this. We can pick our starting point via this. So let's do something like that. And this is the one that gets fed in. So spinning that 90 degrees. We got to keep in mind that it is reversed. There's no checkbox or anything to say, oh, reverse this one. And the matrix can't reverse its order of return or anything. So if we want, we need a little bit less. I want the spaces to all be pretty even. So 40 looks to be a pretty similar, maybe 35. And if I want there to be 10 connections here, which seems reasonable, we'll just make sure that this is, I mean, even it might even be a good idea to spin this 90 degrees. And do something like that. And this can twirl around and do whatever we want. Actually, yeah, we can leave this outside of that area. I'm going to delete this last one and duplicate that first one because it's already got the proper settings for us. That can be fed in. And now this one is a little easier because it continues from the end point. So my thought here is we can create a couple of these and just let them twist around, and these become our subdivisions. That seems reasonable-ish, maybe. I can only subdivide after the fact. So that becomes one setup. To keep it clean, I'll make a null, feed this all in, and then copy and paste so we can create a second one. And I'm kind of inclined to just, let's just create 4. 4 seems like more than enough. How do I want to do this? Do we do a full 90 degrees? Maybe. If I say 90 degrees, then that will do that. And then we can copy and paste the entire thing. 2 more. Spin these 180. And now all of those are entering and exiting slightly offset from each other. So it seems all good. Now, I don't want those individual lines. I'm going to turn off the original circle. I don't want these individual lines intersecting with each other. Currently, they're very clean. So if I were to scoot all of them up into the air a little bit, deselect, scoot in the air a little bit, deselect, scoot in the air a little bit. I'm doing this in the cleanest way possible. It might not be the best for the end result. You see that we've now got 4 layers. They're not all lined up anywhere at the same time. I don't think there's anywhere they all layer up 4 times, and we could have had this spin around more than once, but I'm once again trying to keep it clean. I just eyeballed that. Maybe I shouldn't eyeball it. Let's keep it clean. Selecting all of these under num. I'll say, what's 10? Well, we'll say num times 10. Yeah, that seems about right. Now there's a 10 units in between each of those. Now there's a gap there, but that's just because the other line isn't there. So you can see how those all layered up. That's perfectly fine. That makes sense so far. So I think I will search for the word tracer, select all of those, copy and paste. Copy and paste. So we can keep the originals non-destructively, and here's a duplicate of them, which I make editable. So all good there. And, well, I guess I'll group the originals. Alt-G, hide. All right, so now we've got these splines, and they're all laid out in a very specific way with a very specific subdivision. We were able to lay that out however we wanted to. Nice. So each of these will become a soft body spline, and we can apply forces to them and make them travel however we want. An immediate thought is, how do we do it? I guess we can make it really low poly, but an immediate thought is, what if we make a quick volume of these so we can trap them inside of a volume so they don't escape? Seems like a good idea. Yeah, that's a way of wrangling them. It seems smart. So builder, mesher, builder in the mesher. I'll just put a copy of all the splines in. You see we're going to get this nice big blob right away. I want it to have a decent amount of leeway, so the builder, we want this to be pretty low. I mean, I want it to be as low resolution as I can get away with. That probably means inflating it a decent amount. So let's see. No, dang it. I hate that you can't select more than one. Density 1, 1, 1, 1. Oh, you know, I should have here, just because it's driving me nuts. Instead of changing all 4 settings, we can cheat and put this into a connect object, put all those into the connect, and now it's going to treat all those as a single one. Density 1, and now we can set the radius to anything we want, so we can blob this up nice and big and fat. And how far, what can we reduce this to? There's definitely going to be the level where it just like disappears, but right around there seems to be the smallest we can get away with. And in the volume mesher, technically we could start putting a little adaptive in here and lowering the poly count. I don't know if that actually does much to improve our dynamic calculation. So I'm going to not worry about that. All right, so assuming that that works, copy and paste out our mesher in case we need to go back to it. So this now becomes a dynamic object. Simulation collider body, and we don't need to see it. We know where it is approximately. If we need to see it, we can turn it back on again. That is a static mesh. It's fine. All of these, I don't know. I mean, we can change the dynamics tags easily enough, so I don't think we need to. I don't think we need to combine them, but we're probably going to subdivide them a few more times now that I think about it. If I were to select it, you can see that we've got these subdivisions, and it's not that subdivided. I want them to be a little bit more detailed. It might slow us down a little bit, but I'll do one subdivision. US will be a way of doing it. Technically, it's like a straight line. They're not adding additional detail. It's like straight line points, so it's a little redundant, but it gives us more dynamics to work from. So these are all soft bodies. What is the distance between these lines? Assuming that they're all approximately correct, these 2 points are about 17 or 17 and a half technically. So setting a margin on all our soft body tags to, is it half that amount? If I were to say 17.5, I expect it to explode, and let's save it. Twisting lines. deselecting everything if I were to frame forward once it's going to explode. So with that knowledge, rewind all the way, hit the letter A to force a refresh, divide by 2, and that is probably our set radius. There might be a little exploding. Yeah, do you see these middle ones are still exploding? That's because the radiuses weren't all identical. We drop it down to 8, and it'll probably be pretty close. So if we play it, there's technically a little bit of intersecting. We can see that they all just fall. Now, the hope is that we've subdivided these enough so they're just barely kind of touching, or barely not touching, so that these will all interact with each other properly. If we subdivide it more, we have to keep making the lines thinner. Now, in order to visualize this, we should put each of these into a volume. And I'm sorry, not volume. We should put them in the sweep. Give them volume by putting them in the sweep. Inside, their radius should be 8, because that's the thickness that we're feeding in. That is all good. Grabbing each of these, I should be able to hold down Alt and create 3 sweeps at the same time if I were inclined, and I am. I will create an instance of that M side and go instance, instance, instance. So I can just change the 1 if I need to. So if this is working properly, and I shall save it as another iteration. If it's working properly so far, these lines shouldn't intersect. They should kind of push each other out of the way. And that is indeed what seems to be happening. So we could lock these various things down via various means. Everything's moving around a lot. Hitting Control D, we can turn off the gravity so they don't immediately fall down to the ground. They will bump and push each other away. Not surprising. That's why we're trapping them inside the initial shape. I'm fine with all of this so far. Can we get these to be just attracted to each other? I am not certain. Let's try, because we've been having luck with it lately, let's try a force and just see what this does out of the gate. Does force, I mean, it's doing, something seems to be doing something. Yeah, actually, those do get attracted to each other. Now, it is making all these other ones move away. Let's just kind of, let's just be like, okay, we're cool with that. They can do that. Now, already you see that we're getting these lines kind of interlocking and like they're really close to each other. I'm really happy that the force works this way, by the way. So that seems good. And those are all getting wrapped around each other. It is tightening up a little bit. Not surprising if they're going to be doing that. In fact, as we twist them, there's a good chance there'll be additional problems with that. But like I said, we're building this for real. So I need to see what the scale of this thing is, because we did shrink a little bit. 64 subdivisions is really nice. Subdivided right there seems to be about the midpoint. With no gravity, this will be about the midpoint. So that is going to be the place where the field force will do something for us. So simulate forces, field force. Cross section of this will be helpful. Nice big cross section, no height on Y. Jump this up to 500 by 500. All right, that should give us a nice cross section. Feed it this end side. You can see it's trying to travel around. We actually don't want that at all. I want this immediately to go to radius. Increase the radius, and you can see that they all want to get attracted to that center point. As we had sort of done earlier, I can increase this quite large, so even if it's outside of that, it's still going to try and get to the middle. And under the remapping, we'd say full strength. So it's like, okay, if it's anywhere here, it's trying to get to these center points. Now, that could be bad as far as pulling these outer lines in, but let's just see what this gives us, not changing anything else. So they're already all self-attracted, and hopefully they're all hanging out in that this line is telling them to all be there. In fact, I mean, to a degree, there's a good chance we could turn off the self-attraction, and they should still all end up in about that same spot. You can see that there's a lot more kind of overshoot and overlap. The strength is not very strong. Cranking this back to 40 makes it more like gravity. And now you see there is no force, but it's behaving a lot like the force was, and that's good for what we're trying to do, actually. So with that behaving, we're seeing a little bit too much power here. This is shape is giving us a little too much information. So under display, I'm gonna say don't do the length. So it gives us the direction, but not the strength. And now all these lines are getting kind of locked on top of each other. We're being a little bit brute force with this. Maybe not as elegant, but we'll see what we end up with. Now, the interesting thing with this is the way it's twisting. Like right there, it does seem to twist around and around and around and around. But if we watch, as it continues in, I don't know, maybe I am fundamentally doing this not correctly. It's really nice looking though. I love that kind of look. I love the ambient occlusion type of look. Yeah, well, I'm definitely starting to think that this is not dynamically driven because these individual lines don't seem to be worrying about being dynamic, or they are dynamic. It's dynamic in a way that we can't run with. The main next bit I was going to do, but now I'm thinking it's in contradiction to these lines shooting out from it, was adding some twist in. So I'm going to throw it in here, but I expect it to sort of break everything. So I don't have high hopes for this. We'll see what happens. A helix with a, let's say 30 by 30. Spin it around a bunch of times. I'll add a 0 onto that. And that gets its very own spline wrap. The helix is inherently on Z, which means the spline wrap is going to be facing on Z around the end side. And now it's a little hard to see, but you see there's a spiral spinning around that entire shape. So using that spiral in our field force, we can set that to an along. So give that full power and the along, and that's on the helix. So yeah, that seems correct. The shape is going to be a little bit difficult to see, but yeah, I think the rotations are correct on there. Now, technically, that's pulling from everywhere. I'm not even sure what the end result of this will be. It's probably overriding the previous one quite a bit. So let's just hit play and see what happens. Okay, well, okay, multiple things. It is working in some ways, but it's kind of it's a little too powerful, and it is making things travel along. So actually that does make sense. Yeah, I've got a better way of doing it. But you can see that's actually getting attracted to the center, and it is twirling them around. You'll see them start to get more twisted, but there's also this forward motion that it's naturally getting. So they're all twisting. You can see the twisting motion happening right away. It's pulling in these outside ones, but they are twisting, but it's also inherently making them travel forward. So it's actually pretty interesting. I'm happy it's running so quickly, and it's actually working reasonably well. It's just not what we're going for specifically. But you see, they're actually getting very nicely tangled and twisted around. They're just also getting some speed traveling. So, like I said, I already think that this is not necessary. This is not going to give us the final end result we want. However, I can turn off this helix, and here's a better way of doing this. I don't want that forward motion, so a radius of 30 seems fine, and we can crank up those subdivisions. Let's say 24. However, this time I'll create a cloner on an end side, cloning that on, I'll just clone onto an object, and the object will be that end side we had. So now you see we get a series of rings, and now there's no forward motion implied, and each of them can become their own little twisting, spinning radius. So all these will want to spin in that same direction. So I expect it to kind of twirl around. That should be treated as a spline. So inside the field force, I can replace that helix just by dragging it on top of it. And now this should be being seen as it. Hitting play, these all have the same motion. So it's been constantly doing this dishwasher type of thing where all are spinning and whatnot. But you see there's no forward motion anymore, but they are all twisting around. So yeah, it's actually doing a pretty nice job of tangling them all up in place. And yeah, we get a really nice tangle going. And that's not, because it's ruining where the line started. That's kind of messing it up. But in theory, if we didn't let go too far and we locked one of those points down, so it's like, okay, this point's not going anywhere, but everything else can start twisting up. Potentially that could work. And actually, I mean, by itself, that's a pretty neat motion. If we were to hide all these extra things we're seeing, I feel like just this motion, like that's kind of neat. Like it's like kind of this infinite twisting happening. So that by itself is kind of cool. Bing, 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 bing. We don't need that one. So that's fine. Saving it as another version. And then essentially we're at a dead end here of how far this could super go. And it would have been a good idea to make a few materials to go along with it just for fun. The one last thing you could do would be alternating every other one of these so that they spin the opposite direction. Multiple ways you could do that, of course. The one that immediately jumps to mind that would be easiest would be throwing that into a connect, duplicating it, and on one of them spinning it 180. not sure if I did the right axis or not, but it should automatically update if it did. And so every other one of those, it seems like they're fighting a little bit more. So I think every other one of them is trying to twist in the opposite direction, which might be too much. There might be too many of them. And there's various ideas there. If I lower the amount, then that might calm them down a little bit. So yeah, there's opposite. So you can kind of get this little intertwisting between them. And you see it's a very different effect. And in some of the shots, I almost feel like it was more like that we were seeing. Did we actually solve the initial thing? No. Did we make something kind of neat and interesting? Yes, I think so. Even that matrix feeding into a matrix to create a spline the way you want to control it, that's pretty cool. I like that. And yeah, everything worked pretty straightforward here. It just goes to, ultimately, did they all twist up? And I'd be curious how they did it, to tell you the truth. You have it kind of fall off on one side. Yeah, from a very, if it was just like, okay, I have to, instead of building a big dynamic rig, how would I just like brute force it? And I'm not even sure how I'd go about doing a brute force version of that. Not totally sure. Yeah, I'm not certain. Can you make this loop? No, you cannot. Yeah, who knows? Maybe there's a way you could technically make it loop, but it's not something I'd be worried about because, first of all, everything's going to be very, like, when one of them decides to like really flap out, floop, I don't think that you could, that's not going to come around again in that same specific way, and definitely not timed at the same time. A different one is flapping out. So as far as very specifically doing that, I don't think so. Now, if you did want to make it loop, I think what you could do is let it get to a particularly twisted state, something like this, where it's like, okay, that's all pretty twisted. And instead of letting them churn around, then you could just feed this through and do like a spline wrap, and then you could twist that around. So you wouldn't get them all churning, but you could get them doing that infinite twist look for sure. And keep in mind, some of the reason that this is working decently well is that we are trapping it inside this shape. If it didn't have that shape, then these might be going extra nuts. In fact, let's just find out. Turn it off, and yeah, without them being trapped in there, they're just like, see ya, and they fly away. So that is apparently a decently important variable that we put in, so I'm glad we did. Yeah, that is definitely stopping it from going too crazy. Yeah, neat question. I like it. I feel like there's potential. I mean, there's potential in the technique we end up with, and there's potential in going back and trying to figure out how they originally did it. In either case, that'll have to wait for another day. So we will wrap this one up. So quick notes on this stuff. Like I said, I saved all those scene files. If you're interested, if you're supporting on Patreon, you can get access to all of these scene files. In addition to that, I have 2 bonus live streams I do on Tuesdays and Thursdays, where most of the time we're exploring techniques deeper and then trying to record a tutorial out of it and just doing lots of exploring. And I do lots of interacting with the chat and trying to figure things out. There's a lot more going in depth on things instead of trying to tackle like 4 big questions, like stick on one topic. And sometimes we record for like 5 hours straight. It's ridiculous. So that kind of stuff is fun. If you want to support Rocket Lasso, then supporting on Patreon is a great way to do it because I try and make it so all these tutorials and everything are free. I've been doing weekly tutorials. The 9th one just came out yesterday. In addition to that, it's still, who knows when it gets announced officially, but I just launched the beta for our first plugin that we're working on. So that is started its beta 2 days ago. So we'll see how that goes. Anything else to mention? No, just thank you so much for watching. Thank you for all the questions. Obviously couldn't do it without all of the questions coming in, and that should wrap this one up. Thank you so much, everybody, and I'll see you. Oh, and don't forget, if you're interested, we have a Rocket Lasso Slack channel. You can get to it by going to rocketlassoslack.com, and then you can join, and there's all the same people who are asking questions here in the chat tend to be there helping each other, answering questions, so it's really nice and helpful. That will wrap it up. So thank you so much again, everybody, and I'll see you tomorrow in the bonus stream, or on Tuesday for the tutorial, or on Wednesday for the next Rocket Lasso Live. Goodbye, everybody.